Okay.
They're back there.
Oh, good, good. They're gonna, maybe I should announce this when they're here, so that
Yeah, let's get them
they
in.
know what I'm expecting. Let's just find them. Go a little scavenger hunt. Wait, yes, you. And I think we're actually going to have a display on the wall, which works well for
Okay.
all of you, and awful for me, but what do I need to see? Hello team of applicant team. I just turned on our projector and I was just going to give a brief introduction on how tonight's going to go. So this is the notice of intent for 0751 and 761 Boston Post Road, Weston, BPR LLC. This is the first public hearing for the Conservation Commission to hear the proposal from the applicant on the proposed development.
And the agenda says that we're going to anticipate on voting on this matter, but that is not in fact the case.
Well, right. There'll be no final decision made tonight. This is going to be a multi-hearing evening. So the way this will go is the applicant's going to give us a brief presentation, or maybe not so brief, explain things, and also I should say, with this being the wetlands hearing, really the Conservation Commission's charge is strictly to look at the potential impacts to wetlands. And so that's work within 100 feet of the wetlands or 200 feet of rivers. And that's something that's very different from, like, say, the ZBA hearing, etc. Once the applicant presents, the Conservation Commission is going to have a chance to ask questions first. So it's really important. You might have various questions, but please hold them. Unless you can't hear, if you can't hear the presentation, please let us know. But really try to hold your questions until after the Conservation Commission has an opportunity. People will have a chance to comment. And again, this is sort of the first of probably a few different public hearings on the particular matter. And then we also have in the audience Patrick Garner, who is the Conservation Commission's outside consultant. So we'll be hearing from him various times throughout the evening, maybe. Does that sound good? Okay. We do have a sign-in sheet, so be sure everyone signs that. And I'm supposed to have a functional computer so that we can see a presentation. Let me see. And in the meantime, maybe the applicant's team can introduce themselves and ensure that you have your green cards or abutters notifications prepared.
Good evening. My name is Lars Enyam. I'm with Mill Creek Residential, as the applicant for the notice of intent as well as for the overall larger project for 751. Joined by Rich Kirby with LEC Environmental, who was working with Brian Madden, who filed the notice of intent filing with this board. Mark Romanowitz, who's the Salt Marsh Design, is helping us with the development process, and then Rick Latini, the civil engineer from Howard Stein Hudson, is here as well. And lastly, Debbie Horowitz, our attorney from Goulson and Stores, is here as well to help answer any questions. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, folks.
I have another one.
I put the two. I got two attachments from you today, Mark. Are those the two you want to show?
Just the last one had a little more definition to it.
Okay.
It was a little clearer to see. Saying they're the same slides.
Okay. I think I need that one. Maybe. I don't think I have an HDMI on this. No. This should work. Oh, actually, no. Oh, HDMI, no. I see. many buttons. Oh, maybe I should have done that. Any conservation matters anyone wants to learn about? We have a grand opening to the rail trail this Saturday. Should be very exciting.
Is it time out?
I think I shouldn't have shut it off. That was a mistake. No, but, I mean, it shouldn't take that, it should just be like a couple minutes, right? Yeah. Sorry, guys.
In the pinch, I might have a folded plan of the presentation too, so.
Yeah, I also have a PowerPoint projector upstairs too, but I feel this would make it so much easier. I need to shut off this lights while we're working on this. You're totally fine where you are. Just gonna sneak behind you. Is that okay for everyone?
The green light has stopped flashing.
Oh, yes. All right.
There we go.
Good, good sign. So you guys sent me two. Oh, there. One of them said Weston presentation slide, the other one said PSTR Weston presentation board.
The last email.
I know. Well, you'll see it probably once you upload it, right?
They're both the same.
Oh, okay. Okay. No signal. That's not a good sign, huh? When did that pop up?
It came up as HDMI.
Oh, it did?
Yes.
Yes!
Yeah.
Hey.
All right. Sorry, everyone. Okay, how does that look?
Looks good.
Okay.
Do you by chance have a laser pointer?
I do. Huh. I think it's on. Yep, there we
Okay,
go.
great. Here are the green cards we received to date.
Thank you very much.
And I emailed you earlier today 2 copies of returned letters.
I did see that.
Okay. I'm Rich Kirby from LEC Environmental Consultants, and we filed the notice of intent application for this housing development. The project site is on the north side of Boston Post Road near the Wayland Town line. I'm sure at this point many of the commission members are familiar with the site. There was an abbreviated notice of resource area delineation filed a few years ago by others, establishing the resource areas, including the bordering vegetated wetland boundary, the riverfront area associated with Cherry Brook, which flows through the wetland area to the north of the proposed development. One thing the ANRAD was silent on was the extent of bordering land subject to flooding, and I'll get to that in a moment. So basically we have Boston Post Road down here, and this southern portion of the site is largely developed now with a variety of single-family homes and barns and other house structures, fenced pastures, etc. And the development is largely focused on within that portion of the site. It does get into some of the forested uplands bordering on the, adjacent to the bordering vegetated wetlands. And the vegetated wetland boundary is this blue line here. If you can see, we have the 25-foot buffer zone extending from it. And then we have this Zone A boundary here. The Zone A boundary on one side and Zone X on the other. That's from the FEMA flood insurance rate map. And that identifies the extent of the 1% annual chance flood, which used to be called the 100-year floodplain. And that line is sometimes given an elevation, sometimes it is not. Downstream of this Cherry Brook stream system, across Warren Avenue, there is an elevation sign. It's 158. This wetland system is very flat and not a whole lot of elevation gradient through the system, but there is no elevation sign associated with our portion of the site, which is the Zone A. So that's important to remember. I'll get back to it in a moment. We're proposing 180 units, I believe, of housing on this lot, with 2 larger apartment buildings and then detached dwellings situated throughout. We have a primary access road providing access to and from the site from Boston Post Road, with some dead-end streets and cul-de-sacs providing access to some of the detached homes. Our limit of work line occurs back here. It's along the 25-foot. We tried to respect the 25-foot as best we can. Our average setback for our limit of work is 38.5 feet. So while we do encroach into the 25 slightly here and there, our average is 38.5 feet. And that's largely due in part to a retaining wall that's proposed along portions of the rear of the property. And the retaining wall is proposed to limit the grading associated with the project and limit the work that's in the buffer zone. But in order to construct the wall, you do need temporary access on the other side of it. We've allowed for 10 feet. We believe that's a conservative estimate. Most of that wall construction will be a block-style wall. So unlike a concrete retaining wall, which you need to excavate down below the frost line to make sure that the wall is properly installed, doesn't frost heave up over time, a block-style wall can set higher in the soil profile. So you basically remove the topsoil until you get to some good subsoil, put down your bedding material, install the first course, and then start building a block wall on top of that first course. And that's usually can be done from the uphill side or the development side of the retaining wall. But we've allowed 10 feet of construction access, and as noted in the notice of intent application, any temporary alteration for construction access to construct that wall, whether it's in the 25-foot or not, could be restored through enhancement plantings, native seed mixes, etc. So that's certainly something that that we can look at and provide further detail as we go down the permitting path. For work in the Zone A, which again, that's the boundary given by the FEMA flood elevation. I'll have to check the number here, but we're altering something like 100 square feet. 40 square feet, in fact. About 100 cubic feet of fill material within that FEMA mapped Zone A. But we're providing much more compensatory flood storage. And what the project engineer has done is he's basically analyzed any filling that is occurring at or below elevation 159. 159 is a foot above that elevation 158, which we know is the FEMA designated flood elevation on the downstream side of Warren Street. So 159 we believe is a conservative elevation. Any lands that we're filling below elevation 159, compensatory flood storage will be provided for that fill. And in the back of the notice of intent application, the engineer has prepared calculations that show, well, how much land are we actually filling between those elevations. The lowest elevation, I think, is 156 point something, up to 159. And so they analyze how much fill are we bringing in between those elevations and how much compensatory flood storage can we provide, are we providing for each elevation that we're filling. And that's all outlined in the application. So I think that that's a conservative approach. I think that we're addressing the regulatory standards, certainly in the Wetlands Protection Act, and as detailed in the application. I'm going to turn it over to Rick now to talk a little bit about stormwater design, and then I think we'll turn it over to the commission to see if they have any questions or further things that they'd like to talk about.
Good evening, Rick Martini with Howard Stein Hudson, civil engineer for the project. I'm not sure if you're aware that we are going through a peer review now with the ZBA on the stormwater calc, so I'm going to kind of give an overview because the concept's not changing, but we are tweaking some of the sizes of the infiltration systems and whatnot. So, our stormwater analysis, we analyzed several design points on the site, not just cherry brick where everything ends up in the end, but we are, I'm not sure if you guys can see the board. We're also have a design point here at 775 Boston Post Road. The reason why is there's a head wall here that drains on site, grabs stuff from the Boston Post roadside, as well as the southwesterly portion of our site head to a 22-inch culvert here that goes under his driveway and continues this way to Cherry Brook. So we're studying that as one point. This is also a knoll here, so there's a high point here, so that part actually goes overland under his property, so we're actually studying that too. The other design point we have is there's a swale here on our site, but it comes around, I believe it's 741 to 745 Boston Post Road, and it comes here and it ends in a depression past, this is an emergency access road, there's a depression over here. So we're studying that as another design point, so we basically have 4 design points. Our original submittal to you, I think we met the Mass DP's stormwater standard, but we're actually talking to the peer review of the ZBA, we're actually going beyond that, we're actually meeting what your current local bylaws are. So that means we're meeting, not only are we attenuating the peak flow, so it's maintained or lower than the existing conditions post-construction, but we'll also be maintaining the volumes for this. And that's true for all the design points I just went through. And actually, in addition to with this depression is, we are studying the water elevations at every design storm to make sure they're at or below where they are today when post-construction. Additionally, too, is the way we have this graded here is in a 100-year storm or something larger. If that depression overflows, it actually overflows through our site to the wetlands rather than going on to the abutters. You may know that Cherry Brook is an outstanding resource. Water is it's tributary to a public water supply, the Cambridge Public Water Supply. So we have extra standards for water quality. Rather than treating a half inch over impervious, you have to treat 1 inch for water quality. In general, what we do is the townhouses, we pick up the roof drainage and that goes straight to the stormwater infiltration system. Anything in the roadway will go to a deep sump catch basin. That goes to a water quality treatment unit. So what that does is that removes more than 44% total suspended solids, which is the minimum you have to meet for this outstanding resource water for pre-treatment. And then after that, it will go into the stormwater infiltration system. So, I mean, in general, I would say we're exceeding the Mass DEP stormwater management standards. Of course, we're still developing, and we submitted a preliminary plan for during construction, which is very important too, obviously. So that would obviously have these perimeter controls, which would be primarily silt-fenced. There's some places that we feel need to be beefed up. We've got to be back up with either a filter tube or a hay bale, depending on what you guys actually like. Some people don't like the hay bales anymore.
We'll be looking for a 12-inch compost tube.
Okay, so you do like the compost tube, but okay, that's.
And probably with silt fence if it's depending on the slope and close proximity to resources.
Very reasonable. And depending on and also there might be some areas where, depending on the time of construction, maybe berms or swales that have to divert water to like a sediment trap or something, depending on how much open soil we have, if it's not stabilized. As you know, we will be doing other construction controls like waste management, material management stuff, because we have to provide a stormwater pollution prevention plan and file a construction general permit with the Environmental Protection Agency. So I'm not going to say any more. I'd be happy to answer questions. I didn't want to get too far into it because we are still working on the final designs, but that's basically is we have like a lot of these subsurface infiltration systems. Just so you know that the high density polyethylene chambers with the stone and filter fabric around them. So that's our primary treatment method here.
Just curious, the areas that you're filling, are those ultimately going to be permeable or impermeable? And I assume right now they're permeable.
Oh, for
For the flood zone?
Yeah, so the map flood zone is actually, it's only some grading, where I've been using the 159 contour. It's actually, this corner of the building would be in it, and there's a tiny bit of this, but it's mostly grading on that one too. So there's a tiny bit in the building would be below the 159 contour state. I did not step on something.
No, this just went to sleep, but it's okay now.
Try to keep it.
There you go, that's your job.
When, so you said there, in terms of compensation flood storage, were the numbers, is it 1-to-1, or are you hoping to dig out a little more?
I know I'm actually, I know I'm higher than what I'm taking, but I don't know the actual ratio, so.
Okay.
And it's,
So it's,
Appendix D in the notice of intent application goes through all of the proposed fill below elevation 159 and the proposed compensatory flood storage. It's all spelled out, and you are proposing more storage than you are fill below that elevation. I'm not sure how much though, but we can certainly calculate.
okay, I think you had mentioned earlier 100 cubic feet.
Right, so the difference is when in the regulatory zone A,
Yeah.
that's shown on the FEMA floodplain map, that line is overlaid onto this plan. And accordingly, we're only altering 40 square feet and filling 100 cubic feet
Okay.
within that 40 square feet.
Okay,
The 159 is a sort of a conservative estimate that the
Okay.
project team has taken to
I see.
provide, a little bit more of a, we think, a realistic yet conservative estimate of what fill may happen.
Okay, so we'll want those numbers, we'll want to know what the square footage and the cubic feet of
Yes.
what the team's proposing, just,
That's all in Appendix D.
is it summarized, or is it just by each foot?
It is summarized with total volumes.
Okay.
yeah, what I did is I actually compared pre and post, so I could also do, there's another way you can do it too, you can just show what you're filling in what's outside of the area that's
Okay.
compensatory. I did it more like a pre and post, like this is how much, this is under the 159 before and then after, so.
Okay,
Whichever way you guys can see it, I can run the numbers differently, how you guys used to see it, so.
And how does the compensatory flood storage work? You're just excavating a part that's adjacent to that 159?
Yeah, exactly, yeah, that's what these dark areas here, they're actually green and yellow, like this is, we're only excavating here to provide the compensatory storage.
Okay.
And right here, we're grading here anyhow, but we have to grade a little bit more than we normally would with the
It's
project.
like a little borrow pit.
You show the 25 foot, I'm just curious if the 100 foot is on there as well.
Oh, so yeah, this is that green line here, so.
Ah, So you're building
Can you see that
completely
okay?
inside the 100 foot all along the boundary.
Yes.
so one of the things we'll wanna do, and we'll talk about a site visit at some point, but to really understand the location of where that compensatory flood storage is happening, so, one of the pros and cons with this is, the regulations require that compensatory flood storage be created, but it's probably a forested area adjacent to a wetland, so
Right.
there'll be quite a bit.
Actually, you're lucky, I think these are both next to a trail. So, as it turns out, there's a trail, I mean, there won't be as hard as you think of to get to them. So
Oh, yeah, no, in terms of access, yes, I'm talking about the
Oh, it's
impact
fine, yes.
to the natural
Yeah.
environment.
And actually, yes, we've actually.
We love bushwhacking through really thick stuff, so access is not a problem, it's the impact to the natural environment.
Yeah, we've had to adjust obviously our counts because of that volume difference between tree provide and
Right.
grass,
And so one of the questions is, is there a better place for compensatory flood storage on the property that might not impact natural, if that is
It might
natural?
already be cleared.
Right,
Right.
right. I know there's some lawn area on the back side of the property, I don't know if that's along adjacent to the flood zone that could be potentially assessed for, creating compensatory flood storage, so that's something we'll be assessing.
Do you feel that there is flexibility for that?
I feel like the low areas are all pretty wooded, so.
Yeah.
But maybe you find a part that's not as pristine as another or something.
Right.
like that.
So Michelle, are you talking about the north field?
Yeah,
along
yeah,
the Bike trail?
yeah,
So
We haven't looked at
I'm
that.
talking off the other side, all right, I wasn't even thinking the other
Across
side.
across the
Yeah.
wetlands, yeah.
Yeah.
Still part of
I was
the
thinking more immediate, right, we gotta get
right.
the other side.
Because it doesn't matter where it goes.
Well, it has to be, it matters on the elevation.
Right,
The
right, but as
elevation
long
has
as
to,
it's part of that
within
blob.
the same, local,
Yeah.
approximate
Same elevation
wetland
line.
system, I
Right.
think there's some area, room for discussion there.
Just a quick naive question, I know we keep talking like 159, what's the science behind that? I mean, it's not just like, well, down here it looks like this, and,
Well, actually, we have GZA that works for us, and they have hydrogeologists and whatnot, and, so I actually discussed it with them, like the 158, they actually thought it wouldn't even, they thought they wouldn't even fluctuate by even inches, because it's so flat, and I think the thing is probably over tops warrant out, and 100 years to make, it's pretty low, and, as you guys probably aware, I think the culture actually for emergency, when that thing, stick it's in that, you get an overflow, so. So, yeah, so basically, we talked to someone that does it all the time, and they thought it'd be within inches, like, let's just take a foot and,
There'll be some, and maybe this could segue into, one of the things you probably should vote tonight is to ratify the hiring of Pat Garner for review under chapter 53G, paid for by the applicant, which the commission has authorized me to make the initial assessment, and we've already moved forward, which allowed us to A, ask the applicant for money, which he did provide, and B, for Pat Garner to be here tonight. So it probably makes sense for us to ratify Pat Garner's involvement as the commission's outside consultant.
Do you want to just do that right now?
Yeah, I would do that.
Just get that over
Yeah.
with? I think that's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
A motion,
Need a motion?
yes.
Okay, I, so moved.
Second.
And so all in favor?
Aye. Who seconded that, Ellen?
Ellen.
Okay. And so then, in terms of this, one of the things we could just have Pat look at potentially is certainly the flood zone question. That was one thing that was left open as part of the wetland delineation approval that happened, I don't even know, 2 years ago. We left this question open, Pat, so I think that's one of the things we'd like your opinion on through this process, is whether that sounds like a logical number to map out to.
I'll look at that, Joe.
That was, so no, right there, that's the BSLF that we were able to review.
Right, so we call it, it's actually not even called the 100-year flood zone anymore, it's, I mean,
1% annual chance flooding.
there you go, so much more clear in lay terms.
Right.
What's even crazier is the way we define it, which is bordering land subject to flooding. So it's all the same, 100-year flood zone,
Okay.
whatever Rich said, and bordering land subject to flooding is the same resource area that we regulate. And FEMA has mapped it in many areas, there's other areas in town that have not been mapped. And so we have this dilemma often, and there's ways for experts to figure out what best to do about that. Yeah, I
Can we
don't,
talk about the 25-foot?
that's actually a
little
good
bit more?
idea. Yeah, it's speaking specifically about what, and maybe, Rich, you could come back up and just kind of talk about, work in the 25-foot, what we call the 25-foot no disturb zone policy. So it's a policy the
Right.
Conservation Commission has, that they don't allow new activity within the 25-foot without a waiver provision. And even though 40Bs, might not necessarily have the same scrutiny to commission policies or bylaws, I think the intent is to still honor that and to sort of assess sort of what, our hope would be that you honor it and still fill out a waiver and sort of see how the waiver or variance would fit with this project.
May I just make a couple comments to start on that topic, just because we got a little turnaround with the projector on timing, I just wanted to.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, as everyone might recall, when Mark and I met with the commission previously, I believe it was over the summer, as we were doing our tours of informational meetings with various groups in town, we had showed with you a version of this plan that was similar, but there's some significant changes I just wanted to mention. So as we had talked about over the summer, we had talked about that this plan reflected not developing the northwest parcel or the field area that was referenced earlier, the two other upland areas of the site. We also discussed a series of different changes that this plan reflects, which included responding to comments from the neighborhood and from the community about various priorities that the community had, which included, for example, we had previously shown the cluster of outdoor and indoor amenities occurring all up here at the front along Boston Post Road and adjacent to a cluster of historic buildings. We had relocated that here between the two flat-style apartment buildings, and if the commission might recall, at the time when we met with you, we had shown actually filling in the wetlands and having the retaining wall running across between the tail ends of the two buildings. And it was clear from the discussion that was not something that was wanted. So we went back to the drawing board, and while we are encroaching within the 25-foot zone, I don't want to take any words away from Rich, but we did pull back, even to the point, as you can see, we've introduced a jog into the wall, which is, for those of you who know about block walls, not necessarily always the easiest thing to pull off, but in order to minimize as much as practicable going into the red line there, which is the 25-foot no disturb zone.
Does the parking garage still run under?
It does, and so similarly, we've actually pulled the garage back, so if you were to look at a building plan, the garage runs like this, and then dog legs down, and then comes across and dog legs back in. So we've done a lot structurally and design-wise to try and pull back from this BVW as much as possible. So I just wanted to make a mention of that, just because it's been a while since we last spoke with you, and I just wanted you to know we had responded to the feedback we received and trying to really ensure we're doing as absolutely much as possible while preserving the programming intent that was shifted from here to there. So, sorry, thank you for hearing that, I just wanted to mention it.
Sure, and I would also add that, and we'll see this during a site visit if one is scheduled, but that wetland area appears to have been created through some sort of historical excavation on the property. It's not really a naturally occurring or naturally manifested, I guess might be the word, wetland. It's somebody had excavated some soil out of there, they intercepted the groundwater table, and some wetland plants started growing. So in terms of function and value compared to obviously the larger Cherry Brook wetland system, it's of a lesser functioning wetland in my opinion. But again, we can take a look at that during our site visit with the commission. The vegetative plant community composition and structure really doesn't pales in comparison to the forested wetlands associated with Cherry Brook.
And I'm sorry, Rich, was that, you were referring to where the compensatory flood storage area is?
No,
Or
I'm
the
talking
25
about
under
the,
disturb zone?
I'm talking about this wetland here.
Oh, that wetland, yeah,
And
I'm
the
sorry.
25 foot is this orange line, and you can see where the retaining wall and associated 10-foot zone of temporary construction access encroaches into that zone. A little bit of a pool patio goes here too. But again, we're trying to take this on balance, and you know, if you calculate the average setback that we have to the wetland, we're at 38.5 feet, which is significantly larger than the 25-foot minimum. So that coupled with the fact that we're certainly willing to provide some details on planting and restoration within that 25-foot zone, or certainly within the limit of work zone associated with that wall, or other limits of work associated with the site. I think there's some potential for improvement and restoration.
How tall is the wall?
20 feet.
So it's a wall with a railing and no access down there, or like long-term residents, are they walking down there, or is it
Well, there's a trail that goes between the, sorry, where's the?
Yeah, there you go.
Sorry, just, yeah, there is a trail that provides access along the wetland boundary back here, so I
Okay.
imagine there'd be some pedestrian access through there, but I don't think there's anything proposed back in here.
mowing
No, that would all, it would all be
Landscape maintenance.
naturalized.
It's, well,
Well, will it be?
yeah, right, so right now it's a trail, but it's on private land with, historic informal approval for the public to access. And I think there's hope that the developer will continue to allow public access on this property.
So we can provide more detail on that.
Yeah, I would hold off on that right now
Sure.
and kind of stick to I think the wetland stuff.
Yeah, that sounds good.
And then, but that being a valid point at some point. So, I mean, there's a bunch of things initially we looked at that I've alerted the developing team to and this is actually a new plan that came in today, so obviously we'll be looking at that, but, understanding that the wetlands were already approved, like those are officially approved through a process 2 years ago, so wetlands are locked in with the exception of bordering land subject to flooding. So, but I asked for like the wetland flags to be shown on the plan and a clear understanding on where the limit of work is, because I don't believe, at least the plan submitted, showed the erosion controls going around the compensatory flood storage area. And that obviously we'll need to understand access and clearing associated with that.
Yeah, there were some plan sheets, the limit of work was not included on every plan sheet. grading, utility, there's different plans, sheets through the set. And so we just need, that's one of the things we need to tighten up on,
Yeah.
on the plan set.
And some other some basic details. I'm wondering if it might make sense, unless there's other commission questions right now, to see if Pat Garner has some initial thoughts, to move forward. And then, of course, we'll open it up to the public.
Yeah, I really don't. I spent about an hour looking at the plans prior to this meeting, and I will dig into them in detail. I do have one question, though, that hasn't come up, and that's whether the development is proposed to be phased, or whether it's going to be built at one time, and if there's phasing, we need to be cognizant of erosion control and how that's being handled from phase to phase.
So the answer to that question is we plan to build it all at once.
Okay. Okay. Then we're going to look carefully at how that's all being handled once the site's opened up, and
Yep.
Rich is familiar with that sort of thing.
Yep.
Two things I want to just mention, because I'm sure I'll forget later. One is we did receive a comment letter from Cambridge Water Department, City of Cambridge, that I received today, and I wanted to enter it into the record, but I know she had commented that she's been working with the applicant team on some stormwater questions and concerns, and that most of her issues have been raised, with the exception of some questions about, I think it was the O&M plan for the stormwater. Sorry, I'm opening it up right now. O&M plan is also missing maintenance instructions for the stormwater best management practices proposed for the site. They request that the applicant develop inspection, cleaning, and other maintenance schedules for the proposed stormwater infrastructure. And that's something Pat will also make sure is done, I'm sure. And then given the proximity to resource areas, Cambridge requests that the applicant update the O&M plan, operation and maintenance plan, to restrict or minimize herbicide and pesticides use on the site. Fertilizer should also be limited. Cambridge requests the applicant add Cambridge to the list of entities eligible to request maintenance records and inspect the site for compliance with the O&M plan. And then they had some construction phase questions about using the compost filter stock, so that's consistent with our request. And then the project proposes a new wastewater treatment plant and groundwater discharge system to manage sewage. Project appears to meet the setback requirements for the new sewer and septic infrastructure in surface water supply watershed, which means everything has to be, I think, 200 feet from the wetland and river, or, right? 200 feet from, not from wetlands, from the tributaries, I guess.
Tributaries.
Thank you. Provided that, and they also have questions about de-icing, like what kind of salt would be needed for the roadways, or if any, figuring out what's the best environmental way of handling that. So that's one thing that's entered in the record. The other is I did receive a letter from an abutter that I forwarded to the commission, so they have seen that. And that'll also be,
Concord Road letter.
yes,
Yeah.
part of the record as well. And certainly through this process, if people have formal letters, or you could email me, and I can make that part of the record, if you aren't able to be heard tonight. But that's the two things I wanted to make sure I hear. And normally I think, well, we can talk about this later too, but what works well with the sort of, as Pat starts reviewing this more thoroughly and I, is that Pat, myself, and the team can all be CC'd together and sort of hash out sort of the specifics. And then hopefully, you know, after we hear from the public, of course, the project will be continued for long enough time so that we can really, I think, get through a number of the details before coming back. And we also need to schedule a site visit, but unless there's other commission initial questions, it might be a good time to open it up to the public.
Well, just one quick one. I mean, we're gonna get more details on all the stormwater stuff at some point. But in terms of the concerns about the runoff and the impacts to Cherry Brook, do you have a sort of general landscape idea at this point? You know, what's gonna be lawn, what's fertilized, sort of the impact on runoff at this point?
Yeah, Rick, do you wanna give the best defined in some way?
Well, I don't know if that would be
town's plan or something, you're looking for like detailed plans and stuff like that, or?
Well, you may not be at that point yet.
No, I don't think we are. no.
Okay.
I can certainly make a colorful plan that would be easy to read or something, showing like what would be wetland planning, what would be open space type, you know, we do something like that, so.
I think it would be good for us to understand sort of what's gonna be like maintained lawn, where's gonna be sort of landscaped areas, as a general concept in the buffer zone
Sure.
at least, but
Right.
probably for the whole project, you know, it might make sense too. But, you know, we regulate work in the buffer, so I think in particular, those areas to understand, where that type of maintenance will be occurring.
Cambridge Water is gonna wanna know that too.
Right,
They're gonna
right.
wanna let's follow it.
Right,
Michelle, you'll need to forward to me also Cambridge orders.
just did it 5 minutes ago.
Perfect.
Any more questions over here? So we open it up to over here?
So what we wanna do is, when the chair calls on you, to just introduce your name, and address for the record.
So, do we have questions?
Michael Halloran, the abutter at 775 Boston Post Road.
775?
Correct.
Okay.
When that was discussed earlier. So, you talked about the no disturb zone and a 20-plus year policy that the town has had in place with zero tolerance. And you rightly so, you discussed that. We also heard from one of the commissioner on the word of question of what the green line is, right, the 100-foot buffer. I haven't heard one question about deforestation that's going to be required to build all of those buildings well within the 100-foot buffer. I know, of course, the Conservation Commission does grant waivers within the buffer to build on properties. To a much smaller, I mean, no scope of this has never been seen in Weston, or in a single project. I hope that through this process, that's something that does not get left behind in the discussion.
And that gets into the tree removal policy,
Well,
or does that apply here?
our tree removal policy that we have on, is really for administrative purposes only, like people who don't wanna file, who wanna cut trees without going through the permitting process, they can cut up to 15 in the buffer without coming to the Concom, or 5 within wetlands, and those can be administratively approved. When it's through a formal, notice of intent hearing, generally, the commission has not had a policy of requiring the quantity of trees, overall trees removed in the buffer. I think it might make sense, certainly within the 25 foot, to sort of have a better assessment of that, because
Right.
that's certainly a policy that we don't grant often.
Right.
What's the act require us to look at?
Well, the act requires the commission to assess, all activities within the 100-foot buffer to ensure that it does not adversely impact the wetland resource area. And so the way that the act reflects that is sort of, in a case where you have very steep slopes heading to a wetland, there's a greater potential for erosion, and ensuring that you have sort of these erosion controls to prevent, impact. Certainly if you're cutting very close to the wetland edge, like the edge itself, that's gonna impact the amount of sunlight and shading the wetland receives, and that can affect water temperature and quality. So those are things that features in the buffer zone that are given specific attention to in the act. But in general, the Wetlands Protection Act is considered a sort of just a pre-construction review process to ensure that impacts to the wetland themselves is not seen.
So we aren't necessarily considering the sort of holistic effect of a forest on water uptake versus the grassy area.
Right. I think, well, that gets to stormwater.
Right.
Certainly, how stormwater sheet flows over a property will be impacted by whether or not it's wooded versus pavement versus lawn. And those all have to be carefully calculated in the stormwater hydrologic reports that HSH has submitted to Metro West Engineering, and Pat will need to get all material if he hasn't, but I think that was received in the first filing. and any revisions will have to be thoroughly reviewed for that. But in terms of, evapotranspiration versus infiltration, and how that might affect sort of recharge of a wetland, that's really more talked about really in the stormwater regs than necessarily buffer zone impact.
And that is pretty well covered through the hydrologic calculations, because it takes a look at the vegetative cover.
Right.
And there's a CM factor that's assigned to it based on whether it's grass or whether the types of soil. So that's all plugged in, and that should show up in the hydrology. Also, I haven't mentioned, but so you know, I've talked to Rob Gemini at Metro West, and Metro West is doing the stormwater review for the zoning board. And Rob and I have agreed that I'll be largely piggybacking on what he's doing, but I'll be also independently looking at it. But Rob is an excellent engineer for that sort of analysis. And we'll be going back and forth and sort of talking about what he's coming up with.
Other comments?
Diana Chaplin, Love Lane. First, I'm extremely against this proposal, so just for the record. I have a question regarding, I was at a lesson from the town from 10 to 2 today, and I had the pleasure of sitting next to the Cambridge drinking water supply person. And she, as maybe, I don't know if she wrote that letter, but she stated a concern about an interesting tidbit about that when Cambridge gets its water, it gets it from 3 sources, and its primary and cleanest and most precious source is here. It is without salt, so when there is drought, salt comes from the other 2 areas, and they are able to flush out some of the salt and provide better drinking water to Cambridge residents. That's not our responsibility from a taxpayer standpoint, but from a civic and the right thing to do. It is very important to understand that relationship of the quality of their water relative to the salt. So I'm wondering how much salt is going to be used and coming into this precious headwater that was not there before.
So that gets into your O&M plan.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was brought up by Cambridge Water in their letter that you guys got today, I think. We'll be taking a look at that along with their other concerns and modifying the O&M plan.
I'm Epi Facilities. I'm in a butter on 6 Elliston Road. And I read the Metro West report and I printed it out from the town. And after I read it, I got sick. You should all read it. It's, the water is all gonna go right into my driveway and my land. I don't need a boat to get out from my house.
So when you're saying the water, storm water?
The storm water.
It seems like they're still working on that plan. Is that?
Yeah, that's going to be changed. Rob said that the initial hydrology that was turned in was not
It's not acceptable.
not acceptable one is under
Right.
revision.
Okay, so it sounds like they're
I hope so.
hoping to make it better. And I think they have to make it. It has to be acceptable to the town stormwater people.
And what happens when they are done and I still have a problem, like erosion from my land?
Not funny, it's not funny.
It's not funny.
No,
it's
no, it's not.
It's a difficult question.
Right. Certainly there are ongoing conditions, so there's perpetual conditions in projects. So one of them is that the developer has to ensure that the area is not, there's no ongoing erosion or that the area is properly maintained to ensure there's not like a rivulet of erosion happening that.
It looks good as you see it.
Right.
But the top part is standing like this, and that's how it is. My house is up high, their house is up high, and it's going into the 30 feet down.
Yeah.
So all that water is gonna collect right there, and there's a basin there. it gets full with a real storm.
There's
Day.
an existing basin on Ellison?
Yes, but
Right,
it gets full when it's really raining hard, like a couple of weeks ago.
yeah,
You can see the water coming from the street all
Right.
the way down, and from the two houses from the corner, all the water turns into the basin, and
right,
it gets full.
yeah,
And then that water goes underneath, and it picks up the dirt out of my land. And every couple of years, my husband will pull it up on one part. It's right by the borderline.
yeah. And so the detention basin's part of your neighborhood, like it's a part of, it's like there's a detention basin. Who maintains that, do you know?
The town,
Ellison Woods is it's a public street, it's not private.
well, it was a private street, and all of a sudden the sun changed and it's not private any longer. And there's an easement on the road.
It was taken by eminent domain in '78.
Okay,
It's part of it, not the whole street.
Right.
Part of the street is taken, the other part of the street is my land.
yeah,
And I don't know how they're gonna put the emergency exit there on my land.
I see, okay. And, okay,
But she's got a good point. You know, the engineers do all this work and figure this stuff out. If they get it wrong, what sort of recourse does a impacted homeowner have? That's a kind of hypothetical question, but I don't know the answer to that.
how does the wetlands scientist?
Perhaps a lawyer can tell us.
Well, let's at first let.
Well, it sounds like
Not
it's a-
advising other people's clients.
It's a catch basin at the end of the street that appears to be surcharging,
Yeah,
there's no detention basin or anything like that.
right.
So I don't know how long ago that catch basin was installed, who
It said-
designed it. I think that, is there a pipe that extends to the northeast that discharges? I think I remember seeing an outflow pipe. We can look at that during the site visit.
Certainly,
But it may
yeah.
be that pipe, that overflow pipe may be too small, which is causing the catch basin to surcharge. I mean, the catch basin in front of my street surcharges
Right.
when we get a thunderstorm.
I think one of the things we've learned is, I don't know of any detention basins the town actually maintains. So unfortunately, a lot of times detention basins and stormwater features are put in, and there isn't proper maintenance, and that's one of the things the town, and certainly for this project, because it's so big, we're gonna require. So one of the things we could require is what Cambridge said, like inspecting the maintenance records. So there'll be a very thorough, like every, 4 times a year, someone has to look at, certain outfalls, the access roads have to be swept or vacuumed or swept of sand and sediment a couple times a year. And so those are things, and, inspection ports, so these underground, infiltration chambers have to have inspection ports to surface, hopefully, and they have to be inspected to make sure they're draining properly. And that's one of the things we're gonna wanna make sure is that annual inspections be submitted to the town in perpetuity. Like that can be a forever requirement. And if we don't get them, the commission can require them, by various methods and ensure that there is proper maintenance. Like we can make sure that there is a company that the developer hires to ensure proper maintenance. So that's a very good question, and that's really the best way to ensure the stormwater features don't start to overflow. And I've seen many detention basins in neighborhoods, unfortunately, that have never been maintained. When you see trees growing in detention basins or shrubs, those are supposed to be mowed annually. So when they're not, they stop holding the capacity they're supposed to. And that's an ongoing problem we have throughout Massachusetts, not just Weston. But it's an issue that we will be very careful to watch on this particular project because of its size.
Is the enforcement of that our responsibility, or is it the town's?
It would be ours.
Okay.
It would be a condition, and that's a valid condition in our order of conditions, to require annual inspection logs be submitted to the Conservation Commission via email or written. Yeah.
Sorry,
Diana?
have the most questions. So this is sort of a question that I have in listening. I don't go to a lot of Conservation Commission meetings. I don't tape them for folks at home ever. It's my first one. And I was interested in the commentary about the wetland area by the swimming pool and the fact that it was a man-made wetland, because I thought all wetlands, once they were man-made or naturally occurring or whatever, were treated equally, except for if you're in a Rivers Act type of situation, because it's still 100 foot, all of our drainage, unless it's after some year, 1990 something, right, where it's not treated equally as a wetland anymore, correct?
Pretty much, if it's a wetland based on soils and vegetation, it's considered a wetland resource area protectable under the Act, unless it was specifically constructed after 1996 for a detention basin. Because detention basins often become wetlands when they're not maintained. But if it was valley constructed, it's like your detention basin will never be a wetland under the Act. But although it's old enough, or maybe it might. But regardless. So it's definitely a resource area. It definitely has a 100-foot buffer. I think the question that Rich was commenting on is that not all wetlands are sort of created equal in terms of the value, the function and value they might provide. It's a low-lying area. It provides flood storage, storm damage prevention, probably wildlife habitat. So there's definitely value of it. But I think Rich was opining that relative to other wetlands on the site, it has some less value because it was that the Borough Pit? Was that the area that was carved out? So at some point back in the days, a farmer, graveled it or took dirt from it, and when you dig deep enough, you shall make a wetland. But if it's the one I'm thinking of, this is where site visit's gonna be handy. I mean, there's an area back there that has a lot of, you can see like debris, like farming, not equipment, but buckets and things. So certainly having, looking at some mitigation opportunity, like, okay, if there is a bunch of buckets and trash in the wetland, cleaning that out will make it a highly more valuable wetland. And so those are the things that we'll also be looking at.
Okay, and then the last thing I just wanted to say, to me, hearing, we're just gonna go in and out of the 25-foot no disturb with an average of 38 feet, as a homeowner, maybe somebody who'd like to build my own retaining wall in my in and out of 25 foot, I feel like we should be treated equally. And that if we're gonna do this for developers who wanna come in and exploit our town, we should do this for taxpayers who are here for the long haul and have to live by these rules.
Right, no, that's a valid point, and that's why we try to stick to this 25-foot policy, quite stringently. So that's a part of this project that we're going to be looking at very carefully. And, looking for mitigation or ways to change it or what. So that's a good point.
Thank you.
In the back.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Hager, and I'm at 787 Boston Post Road, so I'm very near a butter of the project. In 2012, the Weston Historical Society's bulletin was devoted to this particular property. And if you go back and look at it, you'll see really quite striking pictures of the circle. And the striking pictures, of course, are an apple orchard. And the pictures are all from the 1930s. So I know all of you are very familiar with the Case Estate and the apple orchard there. Now, what makes it interesting is the townhouses, I think, are going to be sunk, if I'm remembering all this right, approximately 20 feet. And then other areas of the site are going to be raised 20 feet. So what it means is the contaminated soil from the apple orchard, and the environmental tests that were done and were in one of the earlier reports showed arsenic above the appropriate levels. So the contaminated soil is going to become airborne. Which is certainly not something that Mr. Halloran or I on our side are looking forward to. But I think some of the airborne arsenic may well go down the steep slope. Because the front here, you know, the 20-foot wall that's going to be built on, for a block wall, that's quite a wall. So I think you potentially are going to have some arsenic contamination of the wetlands. As I say, the air is filled with this massive amounts of soil movement. And the only other thing I'd like to say, I think in the beginning, one of the proposers said how things were changed to meet the community. And I think, as you have heard, the community is 100% against this particular project. And certainly not your purview, but I think the effect this is going to have on property values, absolutely throughout the town, is going to be dramatic. The other thing, which I think goes to the heart of this project, the whole point of 40B was to spread housing for all income groups throughout the Commonwealth and throughout the towns. This sort of development, this sort of Pruitt-Igoe in Weston, is precisely what the 40B legislative drafters were trying to avoid.
I think we're hearing that, but again, it's a lot of that's out of our purview.
No, of course, but I think the arsenic getting into the wetlands, that is in your purview.
It's also
Right.
lead.
Has that been brought up in previous meetings? Or was it-
Do we have an LSP on board who's done soils testing on the site and has issued reports?
Yes, GZA has done an analysis of the site that's being peer reviewed by the zoning board's LSP, and we've already committed to conducting all site work under the supervision of an LSP.
Okay, so that's in the works indeed.
And that was the study that showed that the arsenic was above the standard. And why more additional testing wasn't ordered, I never quite understood. Because I say there's no doubt, you're looking at an orchard was probably late 19th century through at least the Second World War, precisely the time that arsenic was used. So, and this is where the development sits.
So that's just another thing we're adding to the list of concerns, or?
Well, it sounds like it's a little bit, again, with Wetland Protection Act stuff, it's sort of like, there's very specific guidelines that regulate, contamination and, it's not hazardous waste, what am I thinking of? Response actions,
Yeah,
licensed site professionals.
that should all be turned up and discussed through the LSP process.
Through the LSP process, and it sounds like it's being pretty well vetted through ZBA at this point. Certainly if they have to do a cleanup, and so what happens if a contamination's found above appropriate levels, there's very regimented soil tests that need to be done. And then based on those, they might have to do more testing, and then an LSP, licensed site professional, will come up with a remediation plan. And if the excavation's occurring, beyond the approved limit of work clearing for the development, then obviously the Concom needs to review and regulate that work. But the commission in their capacity is responsible for reviewing what is being proposed for impacts to the buffer zone and or resource areas, and ensuring that the resource areas, the wetlands themselves, are being adequately protected. So the lead arsenic is sort of through a different department, but certainly any digging or earthwork that's within buffer zone has to be approved by the Conservation Commission.
Yeah.
Mary Jane Sirocco, 745 Boston Post Road. So given that with the arsenic and lead, what I don't understand still is to the earlier question around that green line, and why would we allow building in that buffer zone, especially given the fact that there is lead and arsenic contamination potential. And I still don't understand why the buildings are within that green line and that would be acceptable to the Concom.
Good question. So unfortunately, the way that our state standard is, which again, the Concom is regulating the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. And that basically says that any work within 100 feet of wetlands has to be reviewed and approved, but it doesn't prohibit activity. In fact, everything the Concom sees every night is work in buffer zones. You know, the commission discussed 2 projects tonight prior to this, where one, they authorized work in the 25-foot no touch. And the other one, they authorized work 26 feet away from the wetland edge, and unfortunately the developer altered up to 15 feet from the wetland edge without a permit, and so we're in an enforcement action.
But so what protection does that provide to the wetlands or to the abutters?
It provides a standard that the state has determined is sort of a minimum standard for protection of wetlands. And unfortunately, that's really what the Concom's purview is. You know, if we're talking about a land disturbance bylaw, that would be different. That would be something that does assess trees for trees and forests for forests. But the Conservation Commission is really responsible for enforcing and administering the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act, which basically protects the wetlands from filling itself. It doesn't actually protect a viable buffer, which seems unfortunate, you know, because obviously if you disturb within 100 feet of wetlands, you know, ultimately there's scientific evidence that there is some type of impact to wetlands. You can't expect there to be no impact to wetlands. But the way that the lawyers and scientists and developers all got together in 1973 and finally stamped the Wetlands Protection Act as an official law, I mean, it's a very strict law considering what many states have very little protection of wetlands. But it certainly doesn't go to the extent that environmentalists feel is necessary to adequately protect wetlands. And quite honestly, what I hang my hat on is the fact that we do have 1,800 acres of protected open space in town, where we have viable wetlands, and we have viable open space and beautiful hundreds of feet of buffer zones that is adequately protected in town. But there are going to be wetlands near development, near private property, that's not going to get the maximum protection that's really needed to protect an ecosystem.
But we're not talking maximum protection, we're talking even minimum protection. And this is such an extensive infiltration into the wetlands in that area that it just doesn't seem like that there's any, it's kind of like, well, okay, we have pretty places elsewhere, so we're gonna let this
Right.
go.
Well, so they're not infiltrating the wetlands though, they're infiltrating the buffer zone. They're certainly impacting the buffer zone.
They're gonna impact the wetlands.
But you feel they're going to impact the wetlands.
Do you think I'm wrong? It's not gonna impact the wetlands? This size of a project?
I think I think the values, the functions of a wetland, the wetlands are protected by certain interests they have. And that's flood storage, it's storm damage prevention, it's fisheries and wildlife. And those interests with proper erosion control protection outside the wetlands can be adequately protected. They're not filling the wetlands themselves. Under the Wetlands Protection Act, this is a permittable project. I mean, there are projects that cross wetlands and fill wetlands. You can fill up to 5,000 square feet of wetlands under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. And there are many towns that see projects where 40Bs are filling 5,000 square feet of wetlands, or 4,999. And they can be appealed by abutters and they get overturned by DEP, Department of Environmental Protection. That's the unfortunate reality of sort of tying a regulation and a law with science and the reality of what you know can be, that is permitted in a community. It's not the best scenario, but it's what the law provides.
This is the beginning of the process for us. I mean, the first time they came, I mean, they were talking about putting a bridge through the wetland, right, and building on the back part of the property, and, you know, the buildings were shifted, where the parking garage is actually, you know, entering a resource area. So, you know, I think that we're all just coming up to speed, and we have a lot to learn with what's going on. And then the good thing is if we make a decision you disagree with, or that they disagree with, there's a mechanism for you to appeal to the state. So it's not, we're not the only, you know, we're not the only arbiters here.
Anyone else? So,
We have to decide on a site visit and when we wanna continue this to.
and we wanna make sure, in terms of, our attendance,
Oh,
our
yes.
commission member, who's gonna be here, who's not, so that we
Right,
have the
right.
quorum that this is maintained.
Yeah, and we actually have, and of course I didn't write that down, unfortunately, although we
You
can get
have
on, cause I think Joe's also gonna be out the second hearing in November.
Is the first hearing in November the 12th?
It's the 12th. Actually, I think Joe's gonna be gone the 12th. Does anyone have the bad Concom schedule? Oh wait, I have access to that.
Yeah, that's just you should be able to get that.
Well, if I can get online.
Oh,
Did we finalize the new next schedule?
Yeah, we
Oh.
finalized it. Okay.
well, it's on that Google Doc.
Well, while we figure out the continuance, why don't we also talk about site visits? I will tell you this, our next meeting on the 29th.
October.
Yeah. I don't know if we wanna do a separate day for this. Part of me thinks we wanna do a separate day for this.
Yeah, I think it's worth, it's gonna be a big piece of land.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what are folks thinking in terms of scheduling a site visit?
I'm easy.
Do we wanna do like an alternating Tuesday, like not October 29th? Cause we have several things we could see that night. Okay, no?
I mean, the only issue I have for the matter is the 22nd to the 27th.
22nd to 25th, okay.
This work.
Somebody throw something out. What do we wanna do?
Can we do Monday the 20, can we do the 28th or the 21st?
Are we talking November?
We're talking about October,
October.
soon.
Is there a problem with the 29th? I mean, why do you feel it?
Well, that's a good question. We definitely have French, we only have one notice of intent, so we have to do 7 French Road.
That's closed in terms of getting more people, we're getting more hearings, right?
Well, yeah, it's closed, yep. We also have, we're actually doing land management that night, so we have lots of land management funds. But we don't necessarily need to go visit things, so we could do the 29th. We could do this first, and then as long as I had a couple people to go to 7 French, that would be fine too. So we could do like a 9 or 9:30. Travis gonna talk regardless.
And then
I'm gonna just shut this off.
we're gonna wanna make sure when we get to this, so if the weather's terrible, if we want a rain date, can we do that? The site visit is not open to the public, that's just us.
So site visits tend to be Concom only. Site visits are not linked to the open meeting law, or not subject to the open meeting law. So we tend to just have Concom members go.
Point of order. I just have a question about that. If you have a group of people that are in a public, a committee that's more than a quorum,
Yes.
then that is a public meeting, right?
It's not even obscure, it's just something a lot of people don't know, that generally, there's very few exceptions for when a quorum of a committee can meet. One of them is site visits where there are just fact-finding, just gathering the lay of the land, absolutely no deliberations. It's really just walking around the plan and being like, okay, where is this compensatory flood storage area? Where is the erosion control barrier gonna be? Where's the work in the 25-foot no touch? Just to visually see it, you're right, they cannot be any deliberation, any back and forth, any compromises made. It's simply a site visit for the lay of the land, and that is a specific exemption in the open meeting law where it does not need to be publicly posted or open to the public.
Thank you.
So 10:29
Does that work for people?
Is it 9 or 9:30?
We could,
You guys choose.
you wanna go
I
9:30?
mean, this is gonna be like an hour.
Yeah, it would be
hour
at
and a
least
half?
an hour, I would think, yeah, yeah.
It's gonna be an hour and a half.
I'm okay with that, but, I don't know.
9,
What do you guys prefer?
9 for 9.
I'm flexible.
Go with 9?
9 AM?
Sure.
Okay.
AM.
Okay, and then in terms of our continuance, which is an important thing for you guys to hear.
Right.
So folks
That's-
are not going to be, you will not be re-notified of hearings. So it's very important to know when the next meeting is if you want to attend. You can always call me, and I can update you. And I always recommend, even after we pick this very important night, to call me the week before just to make sure it's happening, because sometimes they didn't get enough material, we continue, so it's, why waste your time coming here if we're not talking about it? So we'll have a meeting decided tonight, but call me, a few days before just to make sure it's happening, or you can check the agenda, although sometimes like the day of, things change, so always call me.
29 looks pretty good.
I think it's
That's-
Joe is not gonna be there the 12th, so I think it's the 26th, which Cynthia will not be at, which is okay.
Of November, you mean?
Because
Yeah.
we're meeting the
Oh,
12th.
19th, we're
12th and
meeting the
19th.
19th, sorry.
Right, right.
Cynthia's still not there.
Right.
So,
Are we meeting the 12th and the 19th?
yeah, back to back,
Right.
Wait,
12th and 19th.
we are meeting the 12th?
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry,
The
don't,
yellow
yeah,
is
it's
not,
not.
okay.
It's, so we're meeting the 29th of October, the 12th of November, the 19th of November.
Yep,
Yep.
29th of October, is that what you said?
Yes.
Yep, and then the 12th and 19th of November.
And then the 10th of December.
So my suggestion would be to continue it to the 19th of November, because we won't have Joe Berman with us on the 12th. And he's our chair, right there, Mr. Joe, who would miss 2 meetings at that point, then we won't be able to have him as a forum. So I would highly encourage continuing to the 19th of November, and that would give, I mean, quite honestly, Pat needs quite a bit of time to work with the various,
And they need time to respond to,
Right.
and we still have the stormwater issues that are in flux with Metro West, and there's a
Right.
lot going on.
Does that give you enough time?
it's hard to say.
It's difficult to say because there's a hitch, and that is that I concur with Michelle's initial assessment of the mapping itself, and that's, it's very, very difficult to read. I had
The
to
plans.
struggle trying to, the plans,
Right.
struggle trying to determine where the wetland line itself was. I mean, the basic, the wetland points are not identified. The 25-foot, no, what touches there, these should all just snap right out when you look at the plan, and they don't at all.
That's already been adjusted, but actually, we're supposed to get more information on the groundwater contours on the 22nd, so actually, going to the 19th, gives us time to resubmit plans when we have the information too.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that I don't have those adjusted plans, so I can't even adequately start my detailed review.
Right.
So I don't know when those are gonna come in.
The earliest should be the 19th,
Early should be,
and
yeah.
it's very
You
possible
can always
depending on what.
continue it if we need to, right?
Right,
Oh, I guess what I'm saying is I hope to have the new plans next week if all goes according to
October
plan.
22nd, got
Well,
it.
probably towards the end of that week, I'll probably get the groundwater stuff on the 22nd or
Right.
23rd, so I'll need a couple days and then,
right.
so.
And I can usually turn
That's,
around comments within a week or two.
Okay, then if I know you
So,
have to schedule
yeah.
Okay,
it.
so the 19th is realistic, assuming we don't,
Yeah,
Get
you'll,
some-
you'll definitely have my comments, whether you have their
Right,
feedback or
okay.
not.
And the chair will be here on the 19th.
Yes. Yep. Yep. So does that work for everyone? Okay, so do we have a motion to continue to 8 or 8:30? That's all we have beforehand. Let's say 8,
Just say
let's
8,
say 8 PM. and I may bump this to 8:30, I can't, once we, you know, say it's gonna be at a certain time, we can't go ahead, we can't move it up
Can't go
earlier,
earlier,
but
but
we
we
can
can go
move things later.
Right.
So right now, we're gonna say 8 PM on November 19th. Do I have a motion?
Make a motion.
Second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, good.